Welcome to Daily 5 for Wednesday, April 5th, 2023. Spotify announced yesterday, day before, something like that, within this week, that they are sunsetting or killing off the Spotify Live app. Now, many of you probably didn't even know what the Spotify Live app was, the same way that many people have already forgotten or had forgotten very, very quickly the Clubhouse app, which became popular during the pandemic. It was this idea that you could have a live audio, essentially podcast. I don't know what anybody didn't get about that, but essentially it was listening to a live podcast or a live radio program. That's all it was, except it was an internet version of it. And I did I don't remember how long ago, it was a while ago now, where I said, I don't understand why anybody thought this thing was going to stick around, because fundamentally, it is just a podcast that's live or the radio. And so if there had been some novel element to it, then maybe I would get why people jumped on it. But certainly in the beginning with Clubhouse, and almost every other one had the same type of model, except for some rare exceptions. And unfortunately, they never really got to gain traction anywhere. It was just basically you would show up and there were a couple of people and you would listen to them and it was live. And I think Clubhouse prevented any recordings, and that was the way to get people to show up because it was a live thing. But inevitably, people figured out how to record things. And honestly, I listened to a couple of them, and I thought they were utterly boring. I mean, there's a novelty to them a little bit. You have to have the right personalities. I'm not going to say none of them were any good, but it certainly never seemed like something that was going to have any long-term legs. And sure enough, it doesn't. Because, again, it's just a podcast or radio. And the thing is that it's not a better version of either of those things. The radio is a live experience in a lot of cases, or you're listening to music or something like that. So that is the live medium, but it's also a lot more varied and goes on for much longer than a Clubhouse session usually did. And again, radio has personalities that make it more interesting. It's geared towards people who understand the medium that they're in. Many of the Clubhouse sessions I listened to, and I didn't listen for long because I was just trying to figure out why it was so popular, and it didn't take very long for me to determine that I didn't get why, and now I see that nobody really did. But the people involved may have been smart, may have been entertaining, but that does not necessarily translate into being able to go on in a live forum for 2 or 3 hours. And that was very obvious when you listen to them. They were not very polished experiences in many cases. And I think even the ones that were, those were not ever better than a podcast where you could listen at your own convenience. You could speed it up if you were kind of pressed for time, which a lot of people do. I don't do that, so I've never really gotten that either. I like to actually hear the natural flow of conversation, but I understand everybody listens to things differently. So some people listen to their podcast sped up 1.5 times, 2 times, that type of thing. So you can't do that with Clubhouse. And without any recordings, if you missed a chunk of it, you just missed a chunk of it. So again, it always felt like an inferior version of things that we already had. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of cases in tech of innovative applications and innovative ideas that are simply worse versions of what we already have. But this one seemed glaringly short-sighted. And that's why it's really not a surprise to me that almost nobody's doing it anymore. In fact, I think Spotify could have made something out of it. Michael Fisher, Mr. Mobile, did a Spotify live show for a while that I thought was actually really good. And it was because it was very interactive. There would be a portion where he would talk to people that he brought up, and then he would talk to the people in the audience who showed up. And it was a very lively conversation. So it's not that this thing couldn't work. I just don't think that the way that many of these companies conceived it was ever the right way to go about it. So maybe it's not so much that the concept was bad. Maybe this is a case where nobody implemented it properly. I don't know. I'm not surprised by this. And I like live audio. So this is not something where I think it's a stupid idea. I like live audio. I just never understood why this was going to be some kind of superior version of it that would last. Because again, it never seemed to do anything that was really all that different than what we already had in avenues that we were familiar with and that worked well and that were convenient. Instead, it felt more like there were barriers involved in this Clubhouse audio model as opposed to making the process of accessing the content easier. And that's just going to be a tough hill to climb. So again, seeing this, that Spotify did, which is probably one of the biggest ones outside of Clubhouse, is folding. I can't pretend I'm all that surprised by it because I never thought this concept was ever handled right. So it's sort of too bad, but then again, it was never that great a version. So what did we really lose? Later.